Do you believe our government has made contact with intelligent extraterrestrials?
Something I can't discuss in public setting.
Do we have the bodies of the pilots who piloted this craft?
Biologics came with some of these recoveries.
Were they, I guess, human or non-human biologics?
Non-human, and that was the assessment of people with direct knowledge on the program I taught.
Either they're telling the truth, and that is something that obviously would be the biggest story in human history, or we have people in really important positions of government who are crazy.
With the U.S. congressional hearing into UFOs, it's worth looking back at some historical cases that might provide context in today's new paradigm, one of which is the night nurse UFO encounters on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, over half a century ago. And these events involve some very credible witnesses, including a top judge. Now, all of this took place in the UFO hotspot of the Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island. The West Coast has always been a hotspot for activity in the skies and even in the seas. And in 1970, what happened to begin the year, well, it was unlike any other. Now, all of this began in the early morning hours of New Year's Day 1970. That's when Nurse Doreen Kendall went into the room of one of her patients on the third floor of the Cowichan Valley Hospital. When she opened the curtains in the patient's room, she was face to face with what she described as a UFO. Now, she was taken aback by what she saw, but as someone who was a keen observer and liked mechanics and racing, she took a close look at that machine in front of her, and this is what she describes. It was about 200 feet across with a ring of lights around the middle. She described the craft as having a glass dome on top, and inside were two slender, tall occupants. They appeared to be male, but their whole bodies were covered in a black material that was skin tight, that even covered their faces.
He had a big head and big black eyes and was dressed in a black bodysuit. They were wearing pure black.
Now, at one point, she seemed to think that they noticed that she was there as both occupants turned to look at her. One of them then reached down and seemed to pull a lever. It was at that point a ring of lights around the middle started to spin counterclockwise. Now, while this was going on, other nurses that night had come to the window to see what was going on. As they arrived, the craft was slowly starting to gain momentum, and then suddenly it zoomed away as just a speck of light into the distance. Now, by this point, at least 5 nurses had come to the window to see what was going on. Nurse Kendall apparently recorded the incident in the hospital's log at the end of her shift. She describes it as follows. At 5 a.m., I saw a flying saucer as low as the 3rd floor of the hospital. When I pulled the curtains, there were 2 men or figures in the dome. The bottom of the saucer was brilliantly lit, and also the dome. It was New Year's morning. Turns out, the nurses weren't the only ones early that morning to have an encounter with a strange bright object in the sky. Now, around the same time that the nurses had their encounter, a couple was driving home from a New Year's party. Both admitted to having a few drinks, but they say when they got home, what they saw on their farm left them feeling sober in an instant. Now, the couple say when they arrived at their farm, there was an object hovering above it. It was bright, and there were 4 shafts of light shining down beneath the craft. They all seemed to meet at a center point, and then a larger beam of light went down to the ground. All of a sudden, the beam of light seemed to stop and the craft zoomed away, without any sound or any explanation. The couple does admit that they had been enjoying themselves that New Year's Eve and had had a few drinks, but they insist what they saw was real and it was not the result of anything they had ingested. What's interesting is the encounter at the farm had been reported to authorities before the incident involving the nurses had been made public or been reported to anyone outside the hospital. And incredibly, later that day, something else showed up. Now, by the time evening had rolled around in Duncan on New Year's Day and the surrounding communities, things started to get interesting once again. Even by the evening, none of the morning encounters had been made public. Now, that evening, one of the sightings was by the Gilliams. They were having dinner in Mill Bay when they say the strange object that was very bright around 7 p.m. was seen moving horizontally across the sky. It made no sound, didn't look like a plane, didn't look like a helicopter, and was incredibly bright. Just after the Gilliam sighting not far away, a top provincial court judge, George Hallett, was having dinner with his wife and 3 guests when they noticed the strange object moving horizontally across the sky. Now, the judge said it was no ordinary craft or a plastic bag or a balloon. This was something different. It made no sound, it was moving very slowly, and the judge described it as enormous, with no idea what it was, but was confident it wasn't a plane or a helicopter. He says he watched it for about 5 minutes as it slowly moved across the horizon and then disappeared into the clouds. Around the same time the judge was witnessing that strange object in nearby Mill Bay, Jim Drummond, a shipwright, was aboard his tugboat turned into a houseboat with his wife, and they were anchored just offshore where his mother lived in Mill Bay. Around 7 o'clock, he says he noticed a very bright object that was large and it was moving very slowly across the sky. It was about 900 feet. Now, according to investigators with UFOBC, this is what Jim Drummond says he saw. I looked up and I saw this light coming in from the north, and it was skimming right under the overcast, which was about 900 feet. Now, Jim and his wife watched very intently as this object moved across the sky, while Jim was staring at it through his telescope. He says it was sort of egg-shaped, but in a vertical position, and the top and bottom were indistinguishable. But he said it seemed to be transparent on top. There even may have been lights or switches inside. We couldn't quite tell, but there looked to be something inside the glass dome. Now, it's also worth remembering that Nurse Kendall says she noticed light panels inside that glass dome of the UFO that she witnessed earlier that day. Now, while the Drummonds were watching this craft on shore, his mother turned on a porch light, and at that point the craft suddenly dropped about 300 feet and seemed to come in closer for a look at what this bright light was. Now, according to Jim, the craft moved between his boat and the shoreline, then suddenly it moved back up to its original height at about 900 feet, moved slowly across the sky, and then zoomed away. Now, the Drummonds say the craft moved down about 300 feet after that porch light on shore was turned on, and it seemed to move closer to get a better look. And that's when Jim says something incredible happened. This is what he told investigators. He says the ship seemed to come to almost a complete stop, and then below it, a giant neon-like beam of light came shooting out, only it appeared to be in dashes or like Morse code, not a single beam. It seemed to come down in a curve, and then all of a sudden, it just flashed out and stopped. Now, according to Jim, he described this light as like a neon tube that had been broken up into dashes or like Morse code. Again, similar to the shafts of light that were seen earlier in the morning at a farm nearby. According to Jim, the lights then suddenly stopped, the craft moved up to its original height, moved slowly, and then zoomed away out of sight. Despite all of the sightings and all of the incidents in 1970 that day, no one is really clear what they saw or what came to town. But what is clear, something seems to be attracting UFOs to the Cowichan Valley because they keep showing up. I'm Sean. Thanks for watching. If you like the content, be sure to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. And leave your comments below. Tell me what you think. What do you think of the sightings on New Year's Day? Have you had anything similar yourself? Let us know below. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned. There's another great video coming up next.